Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's dialogue on H.R. 1, the Budget Reconciliation Bill, also called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which was signed into law last month in early July 2025. And I am Leslie Gentarosmi, Vice President of Research and Industry Strategy at the Smart Electric Power Alliance, or SEPA. And I'm thrilled to be joined here today with Mike, David, and Amanda to dig into how we are seeing the Budget Reconciliation Act affecting near and longer term pathways to clean, affordable, and reliable energy. And so just a few quick notes as we kick off our webinar today. So attendees, your audio and video will be off throughout the webinar. So please submit any questions you have for our speakers using the Zoom Q&A tool. So just type it in and submit your questions as soon as you think of them. You don't need to wait till the end. Because other attendees will then have the chance to upvote submitted questions using the kind of thumbs up, just click on the thumbs up feature in the Q&A box to upvote questions that you are also thinking of. So this helps me prioritize which questions to ask first when we get to the Q&A portion of the webinar, which will begin around 2:45 p.m. Eastern today. And a recording of today's webinar will be available on our website at sepapower.org under the Knowledge tab. So, all right, let's kick things off with quick introductions. Mike, I'll turn to you first. Can you tell everyone who you are and how your organization fits into the landscape of the energy transition?
Sure. Thank you, Leslie. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike O'Boyle. I'm the Acting Policy Team Director and also Senior Director for Electricity Policy at Energy Innovation. Energy Innovation is a nonpartisan think tank that does research on policy design for the energy transition, whether it's climate goals or clean energy goals. We provide multi-sector quantitative analysis and also qualitative analysis directly to policymakers and the clean energy policy community. So we did direct research on the impacts of federal legislation, and we'll talk about that soon.
Great. David.
Yeah, my name is David Springy, and I am the Executive Director of the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates. It's a bit of a mouthful, so we go by NASUCA. We are the consumer advocate analog to NARUC, so my members are predominantly the state statutory consumer advocates that get involved in the public utility regulation process. Predominantly statutory, we have a few nonprofits. We are 62 members strong. We operate in 45 states. The District of Columbia, Barbados, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico.
Fantastic. Thank you. Amanda.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Corrado. I'm a Federal Government Affairs Manager at Schneider Electric. And for those who aren't familiar with Schneider, we're an energy management and industrial automation leader. So our solutions enable the secure and reliable delivery of power, as well as help ensure that that power is being managed in the most cost-effective, sustainable ways. So we're found in 4 out of 10 homes in the United States. We're the largest corporate consultant on renewable energy purchasing, and we've been awarded Time Magazine's Most Sustainable Company for 2 years in a row now.
Great, thanks, Amanda. So we are going to set the stage, and I have a few slides. So next slide, please. This is just a brief overview. It's really just to kind of give you a flavor if you haven't been following everything related to the H.R. 1 and the clean energy tax changes in particular. I would say the tax aspects are generally getting the most attention. However, also wanted to flag that the Budget Reconciliation Act also rescinds some funding for departments and agencies that are administering some of the federal climate and clean energy grants and other programs that have come out over the past year. So especially those focused on greenhouse gas reduction or environmental justice, we're seeing cuts to those. But today we are looking at this graphic of some of the changes in the tax code. And our friends over at Third Way, which is another think tank here in DC where I am, worked together with a law firm, which I think is great because anytime you talk about the tax code, you really do need a good lawyer to consult with because it's confusing. And Princeton's Repeat Project also put together this graphic. And I like the comparisons here to kind of point out the fact that a lot of these tax credits have a history, not all of them, but many of them started out in a bipartisan fashion in the Energy Act of 2005, or even before that. This one Some of them stem back to the 90s. And so this has been going on for a while, where we think about how to use the federal tax code to encourage energy innovation and to deploy new resources into our energy system. And so the Inflation Reduction Act, of course, took this to the next level. It has spurred, tons of investment, and I know Mike's going to tell us more about that in a second. But just to, again, compare some of the changes between what the tax code had said up until the passage last month of the reconciliation bill. The kind of color coding of these bullets here is that green means that there was kind of a general improvement. There's something actually positive coming out of the change in the legislation, according to the authors of this graphic. Yellow means that it's kind of just a maintenance of the current status quo. And then red means that there was a repeal, a restriction, or otherwise some kind of phase out or phase down of a tax credit. So if you see here, this is just, again, not comprehensive. We are just flying through a couple of examples, but in the electricity sector in particular, nuclear, the tax credit was maintained. We see under the technology neutral tax credit, which really is encompassing of all of the investment tax credits and production tax credits for many of the other forms of electricity generation. And we won't go through them, technology by technology, but in general, renewables did not fare particularly well. The wind and solar, I think we all have heard this reported in the news as well. And then there are new restrictions on some of the components that go into electricity generation under a new provision called Foreign Entities of Concern, or FEOC. And so we'll get into that in a second too. So next slide are the transportation credits. So these, there was a slight extension of some biofuels related tax credits, but most of the EV or electric vehicle related credits, again, this is not comprehensive, this is just an example, but especially residential and consumer facing tax credits in general, both for building energy efficiency and other forms of tax credits that were under the Inflation Reduction Act have been repealed. Hydrogen has a slight runway, but will be repealed after 2027, for example. Next slide. We will, again, the residential energy efficiency, the home improvement type credits, these are not available after a short period. And then on the manufacturing side, there is some maintenance of the tax credits for wind and solar battery components that are domestically produced. So the thinking behind this set of choices on manufacturing tax credits is that there's still some support politically for investing in domestic supply chains. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see that there's a whole new section on FEOC. Again, this is Foreign Entities of Concern, which restricts the sourcing of materials from other countries with which the United States might not have a good relationship. So this particularly affects solar and batteries and other components, many of which are manufactured in China. I'm not going to be able to go into all the details here, but this and the transferability, direct pay, and other components, the kind of miscellaneous category. People might not hear about them as much, but they are incredibly important for actually the workability and the value of any tax credit that still is available to be claimed in the short runway of time that we have to do that. So that is kind of my quick overview. I know others will kind of get into some of the details regarding like dates by which you have to commence construction in order to claim a tax credit. And so just note that these are the types of considerations that are floating around right now about how, with what is left, how do you make best use of it? How do you jump into getting and leveraging the tax credits that are available? So I will turn it over now to Mike, who has some analysis related to the bill. Mike.
Thanks so much, Leslie, for that great introduction, and did not envy the task of trying to summarize a massive bill shortly. All right, please advance the slide. And I already kind of mentioned this, but our analysis is done using our energy policy simulator. This is a free and open source tool to analyze policy. And we use this tool to do all our policy modeling. There are some things it can do, some things it can't do, and may get into some of that. But that is the basis for this overall summary of what the impacts of the changes that Leslie highlighted are. So next slide, please. And this is just what the landing page for Energy Policy Simulator looks like. You can find it at energypolicy.solutions. We have models for each of the 48 states and the US. And on the right is the front page of the report that I'll be referencing on our website. Next slide, please. So just want to cover some very high level outputs of when we kind of put all of the major energy policy provisions from especially the fiscal impacts and the tax credit repeals into our model, which has a way of selecting resources based on their value and sort of the accrued countrywide least cost capacity expansion model. Not nearly as advanced as like a utility planning model, which is quite specific, right? But gives you a good insight. So you can see one of the main impacts is the clean generation share. Under this new provision, it shrinks quite a bit. The trajectory was quite quick under the IRA, and likewise, that's driving most of the changes to greenhouse gas emissions over the next 10 years. In particular, there's about a 9% increase in greenhouse gas emissions countrywide by 2035 that we project through this. So definitely backtracking quite a bit and making it, I think, more expensive and a bit more difficult for utilities to meet their greenhouse gas emission goals. I know SEPA does a great job of tracking those. But actually, this may be even worse from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint because we did not model the repeal of the Clean Air Act standards for pollution, CO2 pollution on existing power plants, the 111 rules. So when those are added, I think that orange line is going to pop up because you're going to see a lot less economic coal retirements in the model and more gas use. Next slide, please. So just diving one level deeper on wind and solar. In aggregate, this has a bigger impact on wind deployment than solar, but together it's about 340 gigawatts less wind and solar deployment by 2035 that we see post-IRA. Next slide, please. And why? Well, it's because it increases the cost of wind and solar by what we estimate to be about $15 to $20 a megawatt hour. That's our in-house analysis on the left side of sort of a reasonable range of what you would expect with a decent resource quality of solar, wind, and solar plus storage. And I just shared some corroborating evidence from Lazard, which publishes LCOE analysis on the right to show that is relatively kind of the magnitude we're looking at. And I think the key here is the marginal cost of burning gas and coal used to look pretty competitive with new wind and solar, especially with the tax credits. Now that crossover is a sort of different equation, especially in places with poor wind and solar resources. So that's a big driver of the dynamic of deployment here. Next slide, please. And this is likely to put upward pressure on electricity prices, and we'll get into that more later. I just want to highlight like the main solution if you're not building wind and solar is to build new gas or burn more gas. And of course, right now we have a gas turbine shortage that's really driving up the cost and the timelines for getting new gas that isn't already procured and in the pipeline. Next slide. So yeah, we expect jumps in wholesale and retail power prices from this legislation. On the left, you see sort of aggregate total wholesale price impacts. On the right, you can see a divergence of continuing the trend pre-OB3 of energy or electricity prices kind of tracking or decreasing at, relative to inflation to one that's more increasing. Next slide, please. And the variation across states of the impact will be quite large, and we can get into why. But this is kind of we used our 48 state analysis to look at the different impacts. And I think it has a lot to do with, well, we can get into it later. Next slide, please. The one thing I wanted to highlight too is there is a lot of uncertainty around these FEOC rules, the foreign entities of concern. Treasury hasn't issued regulations on how companies can demonstrate compliance with those, and if there's a risk that there's too much uncertainty, you can't invest based on that uncertainty. So we need to see what the rules are, and then whether the rules open up projects to clawing back those incentives if they sort of run afoul of those rules. But storage tax incentives were preserved, and so we do see, as my hopeful message, we do see continued competitiveness for solar plus storage, combined to some other dispatchable resources that now are sort of more expensive than they used to be. So this is also an energy innovation analysis, and we can talk about that a bit later. But those are my opening remarks. Hopefully that's helpful to frame the conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike. And I think we'll close out of our slides now and just jump right into a conversation. And you brought up the fact of investment. What does this all mean in the investment climate, the business uncertainty? So let's hear from Amanda, who does represent a huge company who's been thinking about this. What are the big picture ramifications of these changes in tax code and other things that you are all are tracking at Schneider?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so I think, like Mike said, there's obviously a lot of uncertainty. There's still forthcoming guidance that we're waiting on. So it's still very much the early days to fully understand, I think, what those long-term impacts are going to be. Right now, I will say what we've seen is sort of an immediate response around this sense of urgency to move projects along, to have all the necessary pieces in place in order to be able to take advantage and leverage the incentives that exist, and to really mobilize and kind of coordinate effectively. So our customers do recognize, there's a narrow window of opportunity here, and we've seen a sharp uptick in the work that we're doing as advisors and facilitators to our customers who are looking to leverage these credits and get projects across the finish line. Again, pending forthcoming guidance, we'll see how all that plays out. But that's one piece of it. And then with other customers, I think we've been having conversations that really revolve around the question of, okay, how can we do more with less? So, some challenges, the same challenges that existed pre the passage of this bill, exist post the bill's enactment. So we're exploring, there's a sense of how can we be more creative with the inputs we have, and with the solutions that we explore, how can we work together in new ways? And so that ranges from looking more at what state resources might have to offer. We've seen certain states open up different programs or expand different programs in response to the federal changes. And then we're also looking or working with customers who are interested in leveraging different public-private partnerships and financing models. Things like energy as a service is a great example. And I'll just give one example of an energy as a service project that's underway via one of our joint venture companies, Alpha Structure. It's set to be operational in 2026, but it's a large microgrid I'm based in DC as well, so based in our backyard of Montgomery County, Maryland, at an equipment maintenance and transit operations center. It incorporates 5 megawatts of solar generation, 2 megawatts of battery storage. It will be the #1 largest renewable energy power transit depot in the US. And the nice thing about the energy as a service model is that the county, Montgomery County, is able to transfer away the financial and operational risks of building and operating that complex on-site energy infrastructure. The agreement works by putting performance guarantees on outcomes around construction timelines, long-term energy and maintenance costs, and then system reliability. So in this environment where we do see lots of energy cost volatility, where we're seeing maintenance and budgets change very fast, energy as a service is one of those approaches that I think there's creative solutions that we can continue to explore with customers in this kind of environment.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. We will go back to that question of states and where the opportunity might be. But David, I want to turn to you and hear from you, just big picture nationally. What do you think these changes at the federal level mean for consumers, for the markets that you are all active in?
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. And caveat up front, I'm by no means a tax attorney, so I'm sort of channeling what I'm hearing from my different state members. Obviously, just as a platform, utility bills across the board have gone up and are continuing to go up. So that just is a challenge. So you can talk a little bit about what sort of the relative impacts of this different technologies or strategies, but the real reality is consumers are facing higher bills across the board. And so, we were saddened to see some of the residential, the home energy credits not make it through the end of this bill. The energy efficient home improvement credit, section 25C, that's the credit that gave consumers some, not a lot, but at least some money back or tax credit on putting in heat pumps and energy efficient products into their house. And then obviously the residential clean energy credit 25D, which was really kind of part and parcel to 30% federal solar credit that really, I think, drove a lot of the federal solar. These are things that give consumers the ability to control their bill and in the face of increasing rates. So there's really been a de-emphasis on those, all of the sort of things that consumers can access to help control their bills. So that's unfortunate. I think that solar, that reduction in residential solar is really going to put a big dent in what consumers were, I think, going to be able to do going forward. I do want to asterisk that because maybe there's some opportunity. I'll touch this on the end. And then obviously the electric vehicle credits were a pretty big loss. And, obviously those electric vehicle credits want to give customers a transportation option that maybe is less expensive than internal combustion engines. It gives, in-home battery storage, which gives you access for resilience and reliability. And then obviously we're seeing some really good results with VPP type products where companies are leveraging the home storage units, whether it's in a car or maybe a Powerwall, to really help the market in the grid. And so, I think losing those credits is really going to have a big impact, across the nation in terms of grid flexibility and our ability to put load on the system at beneficial times and access VPP. So those are things that consumers can actually touch. We can talk about sort of the bigger, broad regulatory sphere, and I go back and forth. I mean, obviously, losing the tax credits on some of the big wind and solar, that obviously makes things more expensive if we were going to buy it. And I know that across the board, post IRA, most of our offices were pressuring our utilities to go out there and find those tax credits. So if you're planning on building out, you had some prudent obligation to go find those tax credits and reduce the bills for consumers as much as possible. Obviously, this is going to have an impact, but I also think there's a relative piece of this, right? And it's bad news for consumers at the end, but in terms of the market for solar and wind and some of these big projects, the projects that are sort of ready to go and working through the queue, while they may be more expensive because they lose the tax credits, relatively everything else is more expensive too. So I don't know that you necessarily lose that much. I think, it'll be interesting to see if Mike's analysis, ends up being correct, where there's a big drop or if you look at sort of the data center load and the things that are really driving load across the country, they want renewable energy too. So I think it's still going to be there. The question is, at what price and what that does ultimately, to the consumer bill. And there's a lot of factors when you get into dealing with consumer bills. Maybe we can get enough revenue out of the data center load to offset some of those costs and have some impact on consumer bills. So I think it's really uncertain which way it goes. Clearly, there's a shift in this administration away from clean energy. I don't know if that ultimately at the end of the day is going to be super harmful to consumers. Climate's sort of a different question. But I also want to touch real quickly before we sort of leave HR 1. There's a lot of other things in that bill that weren't energy tax credits. So, they zeroed out SNAP payments. That supports a lot of people in their food. That's a home budget issue. Medicaid over time is going to reduce. That's going to impact a huge amount of people as we go forward. The Affordable Care Act subsidies, those types of things are pocketbook issues, household wallet issues to a lot of consumers in our country. And when you lose those, that's obviously going to put a lot more pressure as utility rates increase on the consumers and our work to keep rates affordable and keep people on the system. And it's going to have a secondary effect, and we're starting to see this now, is where you're starting to kind of anticipate blowing some fairly large holes into state budgets. I saw just the other day or I think yesterday, Governor Paulus in Colorado was calling the legislature back to talk about how to deal with $1 billion budget hole. And as we know, when states get into those types of funding losses, and I think most states reasonably anticipate funding losses from HR 1, they pull back on other services or do other things. Again, obviously that probably are not ultimately going to be supportive of energy efficiency and maybe less supportive of just consumer household bills. So there's a lot going on here, both with the bill and sort of with consumers outside of that energy sphere that's going to make it a very difficult path, I think, for all of us going forward over the next few years.
Yeah, David, that's a really important reminder, that power sector does not exist in a vacuum. There are larger economic and household and other considerations that are also playing into this. So really, really appreciate that perspective. Mike, if we could turn back to you, I'm really interested to kind of, dig more into this state question. Do we think that federal energy policy changes will have an influence on state energy targets or goals, utility goals, clean energy technology deployment? Where do you see this playing out at the state level?
Yeah. Gosh, there's a lot of dynamics to cover, and I feel like I could answer that question for a long time. So I'll try to stay precise. I think overall states definitely are first and foremost kind of trying to accelerate procurement and start construction where there are projects in the queue or projects that are already planned, especially in an IRP that's already been approved. There's a really great opportunity, and you've seen orders from the PUC or efforts by utilities like Portland General. I saw things like from the PUCs in Minnesota, and then got sort of governor action in Colorado and California, and I think elsewhere there will be a push there, right? There are also things happening to open up direct procurement for data centers and other large customers, so that to David's point, that if they want that clean energy, they can access it directly or like through the utility. I know that the Georgia PSC just made an order, or I'm not sure exactly the status, but kind of opening up and coming to an agreement with large customers about how they're going to do that going forward. In Ohio, they passed legislation allowing for on-site generation or reducing barriers to on-site generation for large customers. So trying to find ways for direct procurement, but again, that does open up cost allocation questions, right? Who's going to pay for the shared infrastructure? And I think there are ways to make sure existing customers aren't harmed and ideally actually benefit from those kinds of transactions. I think in the medium term, this is not the most developer-friendly country or many states for clean energy. We've seen clean energy costs kind of stall out. A lot of it has to do with tariffs and supply chain issues, but there's also just permitting and other ways to kind of reduce barriers to clean energy deployment that I think can help continue the trajectory they were on of cost declines. Likewise, on the rooftop stuff, like in Florida and Texas, they just passed legislation to streamline distributed generation permitting. So, right, it's not just a red state, blue state issue. But I do worry that momentum for state climate ambition is going to be tougher to come by, especially with the budgetary situation that David mentioned. Like in North Carolina, they are either on the verge, or I think they already decided to say, like, Duke Energy and the utilities don't have to meet their 2030 climate goals, right? And I think that has something to do with the cost environment, as well as just the particular situation there that may have happened regardless. But I do worry that with higher costs in the near term, it's going to have a stalling effect on some states' ambition, but others will take up the mantle of leadership. So it really, I think there are great cost saving issues, and they should be laser focused on affordability in addressing these issues, because that's what really matters to consumers and to people.
Great. Amanda, same question to you. Are you seeing certain states kind of as good opportunities for the work that you're doing? Are you, how do these dynamics play out from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that broadly, and we do have the kind of first Trump administration to look at for some parallels of how things work at the federal versus state level. And so I think that broadly, when we see kind of an absence of the federal government leading on certain things like emissions reductions targets or sustainability goals, we do tend to see states step into that role even more. And I think that we saw that in the first administration. I think we're seeing parallels of that again in the second. I know that, for instance, California is moving forward with its corporate climate disclosure rules, even as the federal government stepped away from that. And again, there are a couple other state examples of, I know that Governor Wes Moore put out a response to the One Big Beautiful Bill talking about efforts that Maryland is doing to advance energy assistance benefits. So I think that there's examples of that playing out across the state landscape. I'll also add that, my focus is primarily from the government relations side on our power and grid policy portfolio. So a lot of the discussions that we have with utility customers are really focused on this question of the demand growth that they're seeing and the strategies that they need to be implementing that are both cost effective and timely to address kind of the significance or the magnitude of what that demand growth looks like over the next few years and in the longer term. And so the questions that are motivating the investment announcements and the investment strategies from a utility perspective are motivated around how can they get more out of existing systems, existing resources, how can they see what's on their system so that they're using what they have at their disposal more effectively, how can they improve planning and forecasting, things like that. And I believe David mentioned it earlier, but I think that all of that has led to sort of a greater interest in solutions like virtual power plants and things that utilize already existing resources on the system in new ways and make a more kind of dynamic bidirectional energy landscape. And so that's a big piece of the work that Schneider Electric's involved in. We call them prosumers.
I think we have a lag from Amanda, but yes, absolutely. I think, a lot of those ways to take near-term action and, utilize the existing system make a lot of sense to me. David, what are you seeing, from your perspective on potential changes either in the ambition or the focus at the state level?
Yeah. Well, I do see Amanda's back, but I love that when she froze up, the last thing she said was prosumer. So I gotta like that.
Pick up from there, David. Yes. Sorry for my internet.
It's all about consumers, right? So at this point, it's really, in some respects, it's too early, right? I'm not seeing any states that have clean energy goals, states that have emission targets, states that have, EV policies that are aggressive or electric vehicle policies. I'm not seeing a lot of change. Yeah, North Carolina maybe slid back, and you'll see a little bit of that around the fringe. But I've seen no indication that Texas is pulling back, right? And they're one of the big drivers. I saw an article today that in 2024, Florida added more solar than California and Texas, like two or 3 gigawatts of solar. So I don't see any of that changing. At least in the near term. I mean, you may get a little bit of push around the edges, but I don't see those changes. In fact, they may double down on those changes, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunity at the states. Really, when you look, again, when we look sort of within the utilities films, especially the vertically integrated states, you're still doing the same analysis. What's the cheapest way to meet consumer needs? And the technologies are still out there. And yes, Nasuka, our mantra is get the most out of everything you've already bought before you bought something new, right? So I think there's a ton of opportunities out there. I saw that Google announced that they're working with CTC Global to reconductor lines to get more efficiency. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. I don't think it's all necessarily doom and gloom. There's an opportunity. So I live in Kansas. Panasonic is building they say the world's largest battery plant, about 20 miles down the road from me. They've had to lift the foot on the gas a little bit because obviously with the loss of the EV credits, their market is going to change. It was tied a lot to Tesla and some of the car companies. But we have, under the Biden administration policies, built a lot of manufacturing capacity. We have a lot of battery manufacturing capacity, a lot of solar panel manufacturing capacity in this country that is going to be looking for new ways to get into markets, right? So in terms of batteries, I think that bodes well for utility scale batteries, which we desperately need on the grid. I think that bodes well for home residential Powerwall type of battery systems if you need to find some place to put some of that battery, people's homes. And again, so I think there's some real opportunities there. And again, this is, short term, there's going to be a big push, in the next 2 years to try and figure out a way to get everything done. And I don't know what happens in year 3 when the sort of those initial tax credits run out. But really, I think long term, it takes a long term to build a lot of things. The bill was still very supportive of geothermal, which I think is a really untapped resource. The bill was very supportive of nuclear, which frankly has to be our future. There's no way we put up gas plants and windmills and meet the type of load. And nuclear has to come back into play. It's a long-term play. So I think that will come into play. And the other thing I would say too, and intertemporal, this administration is very focused on getting things built. And frankly, we need things built. I know a lot of people are not happy if you look at sort of the changes in NEPA and some of the environmental protections and some of the other things. But at the end of the day, to meet the type of load that we're talking about having on the system, we are going to have more transmission, or you don't move renewables to market. We're going to have more gas pipelines because you still have to back that system up. We have to, in this country, get to a point where we can build things again. And if you look 10 years out, the things that we might get built under this administration, even if the administration changes and new policies come into play, those ultimately add value and benefit, on our ability to bring, again, clean policies and clean resources to market. So, I'm less focused on the next couple of years and really what's the long-term trajectory and how are we, can we protect consumers as we move forward? I still think a lot of the clean resources stay in the mix just because relatively everything else is, expensive too. So I think that's where we're going to go. So I don't see a lot of changes at the state in terms of policy. We're going to have some bill issues in the short term, but I think we'll make forward progress.
Okay, folks, in the audience, I am not seeing any Q&A teed up, so I just want to invite you again, if you have questions, do you agree, disagree with David's analysis here? We want to hear from you, so please do type your questions in the Q&A box in the Zoom tool. Other folks can upvote, again, the other questions that they see. And if not, I'm just going to keep asking the group here to tell me their thoughts, because there's a lot to unpack here. So Mike, really want to kind of build off those points that David was making with regard to where the industry drivers are. So load growth is clearly one that I feel like we haven't really tackled head on yet. So where, in the face of the kinds of load growth projections that we're seeing, what is the electric power industry doing, and the trends that you see kind of still being relevant in this new era of load growth?
Yeah. Well, I would love to answer that question. I had one thing I wanted to say in the interest of discussion, which is the thing that I am most concerned about at the state level with continuing momentum on clean energy is what happens when all the IRPs get rerun, and what position are the various stakeholders in that integrated resource plan going to take on these issues. Like the modeling, it's incredible how much is at stake in these modeling exercises with what ends up getting selected for procurement. And I know they get redone periodically. Right now, like I said, we got to get projects built that are already planned, and we can kind of get those tax credits. But after that, how do we decide what like when costs are rising across all technologies, especially gas, solar and wind from the tax credits, gas because of the supply chain, and then the uncertainty of tariffs and FEOC, like how are utilities going to manage all those uncertainties? Because ultimately they put numbers into a model and it spits out a least cost result. And ideally it's like scenario based, and regulators have things to choose from, and there's lots of stakeholder engagement. But I think there's a big risk that we kind of retrench into sort of the way we've done things in the past, and a sort of comfort and a desire to kind of wait for the next wave of clean technologies rather than investing in wind and solar because they just got more expensive and more risky. So like that general like conservatism, and that's what I worry about kind of creeping into the process and kind of affecting this and I think SEPA is a great forum to discuss that among utilities and come up with solutions for that. So I hope that occurs. as for data centers, or I mean, I always just jump to data centers when it comes to load growth because that's the big story. Obviously, there's vehicles, electrification, and everything, but I think we're hearing a lot of mixed messages when it comes to data centers and clean energy. Like lots of like the Clean Energy Buyers Association and their members are very proactive about making sure that there's clean generation and that they can have a role in procurement. On the other hand, there's all these other stories of hyperscalers like you know X or Tesla. I'm not sure which part of Elon's industrial complex but building a data center powered by gas or Meta in Louisiana, kind of building this sort of multi-stage gas, solar, and so I think it's a mixed bag. It's clear that the load growth is being used to justify more investment in gas-fired generation and a push towards that. But on the other hand, there are clean solutions, and that's what the data centers demand. So for me, the picture is quite unclear. I want to make sure policymakers give tools to fairly allow them to buy as much clean energy as they can and pay that, and not sort of shift emissions around and shift costs to others. But it's quickly evolving, and I'm not sure where it's going to go.
Well, actually, on that point, maybe I will skip the line here. We are getting up to our Q&A session. We do have one question in the queue, which is regarding natural gas. So you mentioned, with the data center demands, there really is no escaping the natural gas. And so can you say a little bit more about projections that may be out there regarding future use of natural gas, especially since solar and other renewable credits are being, reduced? And do we know anything about how this might affect natural gas prices? Anything related to that?
Is that a question for me or for everyone?
For you.
I would welcome others.
First.
Okay. Yeah. Well, again, lots of uncertainty, especially about the commodity price. I think EIA is projecting a slight increase over time, but I think a lot depends on how much LNG gets built and how much the U.S. market becomes more exposed to the international market, which has much, much higher gas prices. So, we saw that exposure rear its head during the Ukraine, Russia gas crisis in Europe. I think the volatility of that fuel is a real concern that can affect consumers on a very sort of temporary but rapid basis. And yeah, it's really hard to build any new gas before 2030. That's what we've heard from NextEra and other utilities. And the price of those turbines is now over $2,000 a kilowatt, which is like about double what it was just a few years ago. So there are no great options. I think waiting for nuclear is also not a great option, given the timelines and like, yeah, some of the optimism about where the cost will go, I think is justified, but when will it show up and will it or will it be sort of problematic cost-wise?
Well, actually, on that point, David, we do have a question in for you regarding NESUCA and the connection to large nuclear plants versus small modular reactors. Is there some, thought on the different risk profiles? Is there a preference? I think timing is also, an interesting component of that. So any thoughts on nuclear?
Okay, well, I have to say, in terms of an association, we don't have a nuclear policy. So, please, I'm not speaking by any means on behalf of, quote, NESUCA. This is what NESUCA thinks. I will give you sort of a couple of thoughts, but we don't have a nuclear policy because obviously there's a lot of opinions about nuclear across the country. And so that's kind of one of those things that's hard to get a consensus. To me, it seems clear that nuclear is moving forward. I mean, you read about it every day. The Metas and the Googles and the Facebooks or the Microsofts, they have the money to invest, and they are driving technologies, and they are really, if you kind of look at it, like each one of them has sort of like picked their company to bet on, right? They've picked a technology or they've picked a company and they're putting money in it and they're standing something up. So I think that bodes well in terms of making progress. you know, if we had this conversation 2 years ago, the only way nuclear was going to get built is if a vertically integrated electric utility built it, because no one in the market was going to build it, right? Like there was no real internal driver to push it forward. And I think that's changed now. In fact, the thing I see when you talk about data centers is sort of this move from really being focused on integrating within the existing grid to sort of a movement to standing up microgridded campuses, right? And they may still interconnect to the grid, but you're starting to see that push because they can just, well, we're just going to bring whatever our generation technologies stand it up. So I think there's, you know, I think there's reason to be optimistic. I like the fact that the people with, you know, $1 trillion balance sheets or whatever, they're the ones kind of funding the risk profile, right? Like I want to buy plant number 10, not plant number 1. I'll let them buy plant number 1 through 5. So, and then in terms of the big plants, I mean, obviously, we have a checkered history with big plants, right? I mean, they tend to go over. There's just no evidence that they don't go over budget. But we also learned a lot building Vogtle. Westinghouse is investing. You know, you can talk about SMRs, but really we need bigger power than that. And the administration has made, I think, a point of trying to get us back into sort of the building large plants. I think we can do it. I think that we have the workforce to do it. We have the knowledge. I know this is, you know, what they say is that Vogtle 4 was 30% cheaper than Vogtle 3. So by extension, you know, Vogtle 6 would be how much more expensive Vogtle 9 would be. If we have the capability, you know, I think we can stand it up. Obviously, we're very concerned about costs, and from a regulatory standpoint, the one thing that we have a lot of problem with is most states pass a law that says while you're building that, you can go ahead and put that into consumer rates. So that just shoves all that risk down on consumers, and that historically has not worked out well for us. So I think, you know, that regulatory piece that I would really like to see, I think most of my members would really like to see approached in a different way. Construction work in progress is bad at this particular moment. Those are policy issues that we need to change. But in terms of the broad moving forward, I think it does. I think we have a moment in time where it can possibly move forward without putting all of the risk on us. So maybe we get some progress by having the people with big balance sheets and a big interest in moving it forward fund some of that initial risk. So again, those are random comments. Again, not the SEPA policy by any stretch.
Certainly, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I just want to highlight the example of the NV Energy clean transition tariff, where Google was able to directly buy geothermal, which is also, you know, a cost premium, although like David said, it's a really promising technology where the costs seem to be coming down. But yeah, that kind of deal sort of through the utility seems like a promising avenue for some of these nuclear deals.
Yeah, definitely. Amanda, I wanted to come back to you, you know, on these questions of drivers, of trends. You know, are there other technologies that your company is thinking about and kind of bullish on as it relates to either load growth, or another trend we haven't really touched on yet is the need for more resilient solutions as we start to deal with more extreme weather events and other types of pressures that the grid is facing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that on the topic of load growth, and similar to Mike, my brain goes to data centers these days because it is what we've been talking focused on heavily. But again, other drivers like manufacturing, broad electrification, those kinds of things are all contributors. But Schneider Electric in the US, 60% of our business is driven from the data center industry. So that's just a natural focus for us. And I'll say that what we are seeing a lot more of, particularly in this landscape of all these power constraints, data centers need to come online, helping our customers address the question of time to power and unlocking the power that they need to be able to come online. So part of what we've seen from an approach perspective there is one, more behind the meter power, so to the point of like investment in renewables, and even whether or not these credits exist for renewables, data center owners and operators are willing to pay to have power for their operations. So investment in renewables for behind the meter generation is something that we continue to see as like bridge power and gap power, where while utilities aren't able to actually provide the full level of power that data centers would need to operate. So we're seeing that continue, and just become more and more of the approach that's being taken. And those configurations often include solutions like microgrids that do enable that more dynamic and efficient use of different power sources, as well as provide that level of resilience for operations. So behind the meter investment, and then in addition to that, data center flexibility or large load flexibility more broadly is something that we're working a lot on. So understanding what are the technology investments, and then what are the kind of regulatory policy enablers that allow data centers to interact in more dynamic and bidirectional ways, where they can serve not only as a large load kind of demand driver, but then as a grid stabilizer, and to be able to help the grid to be an asset to the grid. And so a couple examples of that is we've partnered with a hyperscaler, and we're doing a modeling of grid interactivity at one of our labs here in the US, so one of our R&D labs, to try and simulate and understand what those enablers are and how they can be most, how the immediate kind of fast frequency responses can be best enabled, and how we can load shift different kinds of workloads and things like that for data centers to also offer that kind of flexibility. And then another initiative that it was announced at the end of last year that we are a partner on is called the DC Flex Initiative, which is being driven by EPRI. So they have a large utility membership, which is helpful for that kind of interfacing of the different stakeholders. So they're focused on what are the data center architectures that enable flexibility, what are the utility programs, and then how can we do more effective grid planning to take advantage of where that operational flexibility exists. So that's just one of the programs that Schneider Electric's involved in to try and continue to prove out and validate the different approaches to flexibility that could exist and tap into those resources where they're possible. So we're seeing more of that from the data center perspective, but then also just from large load customers in general. So manufacturing facilities, to what extent can they replicate this kind of flexible approach? And so that's just a piece of the kind of policy and then also technology-based kind of questions that we're exploring.
That's great. And really interesting to hear just all the different use cases, for flexibility, and kind of like you're seeing this, in different types of applications and markets. And so, I think in general, right, we have a couple of questions here that are, again, related to nuclear, because I think because of the tax credits, going back to the tax credit language, there's a lot of support, obviously, in this federal administration related to nuclear. But is it reasonable? Is it realistic to think that we're even going to see nuclear in the next, decade, for example? Even if we are going to reduce some of the permitting or inciting hurdles, there are questions about nuclear waste, related to all of this. So I'd kind of like to broaden this question to you all, though, to just say, if you're looking into your crystal ball, understanding that there's lots of uncertainty around how this plays out, because, again, we don't even have Treasury guidance yet on how the tax credit, the individual details of how these tax credit changes are going to be implemented. So we're waiting on that. But we know that big picture trends, are pointing in certain directions, given the drivers that are in the risks that are facing the grid today. And so let me know, 1 year from now, what do you expect to see versus maybe a decade out? How are we what's that pathway looking like in the face of these changes that you're seeing? And you are free to answer this question in any way that you choose. Mike, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, good to know. I'm unshackled. It's hard, Leslie. It's really hard to answer that question with any precision. I think David was generally correct in there's so much direct investment happening by consumers with large balance sheets. And I do think from a general maybe vibes perspective, we just have so much technological innovation happening right now, aided by AI. That's, I think, in a general sense, going to increase the pace of progress on some of these technologies. But and I do think many of the announcements, the dollars being invested are real. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some new nuclear projects break ground before 2030. But you know, until we see one with a PPA and a price attached to it, and actually start operating without a hitch, it's going to be really hard to predict how the rest of the things go. I will say it seems like a really central policy priority of the current Secretary of Energy to get the nuclear industry kind of restarted in the U.S. and embrace advanced nuclear. So to the extent he's successful, then we would see more. A lot probably depends on, is there another either regulatory or policy package that can continue to kind of reduce the regulatory burden that nuclear plants face? But then what are the sort of public safety and other ramifications of that? Not an area of great expertise of mine, but something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, definitely. And just in general, Amanda, where are you seeing, the trends pointing? If you look out a year from now, what do you expect to see on the system as meeting some of the challenges of today?
Yeah, I agree that the pace of technological innovation is really incredible, and I think that there is a strong emphasis on investment in R&D that will only continue to help accelerate how we see these technologies become commercialized. From the perspective of like a 1 year or more immediate kind of time horizon, I think that's where what we can do, what we can unlock on the demand side equation is a huge piece of what the solution should look like and could entail. And so continuing to work, to make those kinds of strategies, demand side management, and how can we take advantage of virtual power plants, things like that. Continuing to implement those strategies will be key to meeting the moment in the more immediate term while we invest in these longer term solutions and build out more supply and build out more transmission on all of those kinds of things.
Great. David, closing thoughts on that question?
Oh, near term. So near term, I don't think, a year, you're not going to see a lot. Obviously, there's going to be a big push to try and get everything in the ground that you can before the tax credits. So I'm not quite sure that gives you an accurate picture. Maybe over the course of a year or two, we'll start getting a better idea of sort of what the broader macroeconomic impacts of both the act and tariffs and just market uncertainty that all of those creates, administration creates, are the manufacturing infrastructure that we've been working so hard to put in place, does it stay in place, or do people start backing off some of those plants and some of those jobs? So 1 year, I don't think you're going to have a picture. 3 years, you'll have a better picture. 10 years, I'm still reasonably optimistic. I think we can get nuclear across the line. I really do. I think there'll be a push. To me, the thing that we haven't tested yet, we have a lot of academic conversations about types of nuclear and who's going to fund nuclear, et cetera, but we haven't tried to put one in a town yet, right? And trying to convince the actual people that live in that town to have it again. So you're either building brownfield or you're going to probably hit a little bit of a barrier. And I think you see the same barrier on the transmission side. So trying to build a transmission, there's a lot of NIMBYism right now. Trying to build solar in the rural areas, there's a lot of NIMBYism right now. So I think we have to, optimism should be tempered with probably the reality that getting things to the ground are going to be a little more trial. But I do also think, I follow Amanda on this. I think the technology we have, and again, more batteries, right? We're going to batteries. Batteries give us a lot of opportunity to do a lot of things. And when they really get to the point where there are reasonable sort of option for consumers to put in their houses, and to do VPP, or at least maybe get a price signal from your local utility that gives you some arbitrage or some incentive to pull things off on peak. I think that the way that consumers approach the grid 10 years from now will be much different than the way we approach it. Even the small consumers approach it now, very much different than 20 years ago when I was doing these cases, and we didn't even have, we were using analog meters. So the pace of technology and I think the pace of consumers' interaction and flexibility with the grid, and consumers of all levels, obviously, big players will be very flexible and interactive, but even the smaller players, when you give them an option of having some resilience technology in their garage at a very reasonable rate, I think gets us a long way. And then we're still going to have a huge piece of the lower income that really aren't going to have access to these technologies. And we're going to have to find some way to help them, bring them along, keep them on the system, help them with the bills, because none of this is going to be cheap. I don't see rates coming down, bills coming down anytime soon.
Well, we are out of time, but I do want to do one last 30-second. What's your one call to action for our audience here today? What do you want to leave them with in the ever evolving, fast changing federal and state policy environment that our industry is in? Mike, what do you want to leave us with?
I'm going to go with David's theme of batteries, batteries, batteries. They got extended tax credits where solar and wind did not. And I think they unlock extremely interesting opportunities also on the utility scale and at battery as a transmission or distribution resource as well. There was just one study I'll leave you with. Ember did this great analysis of batteries have gotten so cheap that in some parts of the US, like the desert, you can run a solar plus battery that delivers like a 90+% capacity factor, and it's economic in some parts of the country. So like you're getting baseload solar plus batteries looking potentially more economic than nuclear. And that's mind blowing. That's changing the game. So
we're going to check back in 1 year from
batteries.
now. 1 year from now, we're going to look for the batteries, see where they are. All right, Amanda, over to you.
Yeah, I think my call to action is really around not discounting the role and the importance of continued engagement, advocacy, and education. I think that there's still a great landscape of opportunity to engage with this administration, with Congress, and on future policy developments around these issues. And a big piece of it still really lies in the education aspect. And so it's on us to be able to bring that education and to make sure that we're communicating effectively on these solutions, on what's possible, what the realities are, and to make sure that we're influencing those decisions as they are made.
Great. I love that. David, over to you.
Yeah, I think I agree. Well, I agree with both Mike and Amanda. Batteries. I think batteries change the world, right? But the engagement and education so important. Obviously the proceedings that we're all going to be involved in at the regulatory commissions are going to be much more complicated as we go forward. If states get holes blown in their budget, we might have a lot less staff at both the Public Utility Commission and at my members in the states. So that's going to be challenging. But I do encourage, especially the SEPA crew. I'm a big fan of SEPA. SEPA really provides our members a great resource base and great activity. And I know that SEPA has a lot of members that really remember that we're there, engage with us. Make sure that you're talking to our members when you're talking to the states or you're talking to PUCs. We're going to show up in every case. So you should be talking to us. And one quick plug, just for those of you that attend NARUC meetings, the annual NARUC meeting in Seattle, we co-locate our Nasuka annual meeting with NARUC at least once a year. So we'll be in Seattle with NARUC in November. So attend our meeting, support our members. Like you support NARUC, because we need that education just to be brought up to speed so that we are making informed decisions through this process also. So don't forget about us.
That's right. We're all in this together. These are big challenges facing our whole industry, and we're excited at SEPA to partner with all of you, getting that education, breaking down these complex topics into understandable pieces that are actionable. So we're excited to have this conversation with you all today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Again, this webinar will be recorded and will be available on sepapower.org, as well as all the rest of our resources. So thanks again, and take care, and we will be in touch soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Leslie. Thanks everyone.